Senior Vice President. She's in charge of quality assurance along with a lot of other things. Shannon and I have worked together for the last 28 years, so since we were about 10. Right? Okay, since she was about 10.
I said you were 12.
I was 12, right. No, so we've worked together for a very long time, and so I'm just happy to give her the podium.
Okay. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. Just Cheryl already introduced me, but give you a little bit about my background. I am the Vice President of DataWorks, and my daily duties include being the Quality Assurance Manager and the Regulatory Monitor. I actually got my start in this back in the 1960s. I was one of those nerdy kids who pointed out the rules on the Monopoly lid. You can't really take the free parking money. It's not anywhere on the Monopoly lid. So I did get a little bit more education after that, and ended up doing my dream job, making sure everybody follows the rules and has good QA. Okay, if there was one thought that I could have you take away, and you'll see this in your handouts over and over again, it's that systems are compliant, not the software. I get asked this all the time. The new buzzword is compliance. Am I compliant? Are you compliant? Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. You have to figure out what you're trying to get compliance for. Is it 21 CFR Part 11? Is it your GXP requirements, your predicate rules, regulations, guidance? We're going to go over all that. But the one thing you need to take away is that systems are compliant, not software. And also, because we're talking about systems, we need to remember that we're building quality into the system all the way through the process of developing your system, not just testing for it afterwards. So we'll be talking a lot about testing, but really you have to build the quality into your system. Okay, so we're going to talk about three main things in this first session. FDA regulations versus guidance. What's the difference? 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. Everybody knows, I'm sure, that that's electronic records and signatures. And software development versus system development. Okay. FDA regulations versus guidance. What is the difference between those two? And isn't a guidance just a suggestion? Kind of like everybody saw Pirates of the Caribbean, the pirate code. It's more just like a guideline, really.
You have to take me to shore, according to the code of the Order of the Brethren.
First, your return to shore was not part of our negotiations nor our agreement, so I must do nothing. And secondly, you must be a pirate for the Pirates Code to apply, and you're not. And thirdly, the code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules.
And of course, the whole point of knowing the difference between these is avoiding the scary 483 warning letters. Which, does anybody ever had any 483 warning letters? Anybody? Oh, you guys are all doing things perfectly. You probably don't even need to listen to my talk then, huh? Well, FDA is going to be doing more and more inspections. As the funding increases to do the inspections, I'm going to probably be hearing a lot more about people getting inspections, audits, and a lot more 483 warning letters about their systems not being up to snuff. And, of course, the bigger your organization, I've heard from former FDA inspectors, the bigger your organization, the more they like to put you under scrutiny so that they can make examples of you. So hopefully nobody gets in trouble there. Just to give you a brief history of regulations, it's not a new thing. You would think that computerized regulations are kind of coming into play now, but they've actually, the first GMP came out in 1978. So good manufacturing practices is what that is. And of course, DataWorks came along in 1987, about the same time, guidance for software development. So we actually were in the right place at the right time because we got in on the ground floor and we're following the guidelines for software development right from their inception. And 1995, the first GAMP was published. That's the Good Automated Manufacturing Practices. Well, it comes from the pharmaceutical industry. We're now on GAMP 5 as of 2008. In 1997, we finally got the final rule for 21 CFR Part 11, electronic records and signatures. And about that same time, the general principles for software validation. And if you take a look at the regulatory pyramid that I made, it's kind of in the same order that you would get in trouble. So the standards down at the bottom are the base. And those come from your industry. And there's different sets of standards that might be applicable just to select agents or tissue banking, blood banking, follow different standards. They're just regulated ways of doing things within your industry. Sometimes you'll have certifications within your industry for the different standards. Most of the time they're just guidelines. We have programming standards that we use, and getting certified to program in a certain way is optional. Sometimes we go with that and sometimes not. So same with your laboratory. The guidances and regulations, we're going to be talking about that more in detail, so I'll skip over that a little bit. But just to let you know, the regulations are legally enforceable regulations. The guidelines tell you how to establish compliance with the regulations. So they support the regulations, anything that's a guidance document or guideline. And up at the top, of course, you have the laws passed by Congress. The biggest one here that covers everybody is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It's the most extensive law of its kind in the entire world, and it is applicable to everybody here. Covers everything from food, vitamins, medical devices, from implants to toothbrushes, tissue management, veterinary medicine, pretty much everything. Okay. So, regulations versus guidance, as I talked about before. The regulations are legally enforceable. You can have repercussions if you don't follow that. There have been, I think in 2008, there were almost 400 convictions for not following regulations, where people actually got in trouble. You can lose your funding, you can lose all kinds of valuable contacts. They can impose sanctions on your laboratory, so it's very important that all of the regulations are followed. A guidance, as I said, is not binding, but every bit of guidance is tied to a particular regulation. It supports it. And you don't have to follow the guidance, but if you have a way of doing something that's better or different or specific to your particular laboratory, you need to be able to prove to the FDA why your way is better and why you don't follow the guidance, and it needs to be documented very well. Not many people are in that boat. Some examples of a regulation would be any of your predicate rules. So the CGMP, which is your 21 CFR Part 211, new drugs, Part 312, 820 medical devices, any blood banking labs, or your software, for some reason, in a blood banking situation, your software is considered a medical device. So you're subject to Part 820. A little bit more extensive regulation, quite a bit more specific. And I can see those changes from what I've talked to people that have been FDA inspectors in the past. Some of those regulations are going to become more common for many types of laboratories. So at DataWorks, we're already looking into making sure that our software is able to be compliant with Part 820 for medical devices. So those are your predicate rules, your GCP, good clinical practices, GLP, good lab practices. All those are predicate rules, and they are regulations. The guidance, a couple examples of guidance documents would be the pharmaceutical quality system and the guidelines for software validation. Those are guidelines. Okay. And these are your basic principles for the regulations. It's all part of an attempt to prevent problems with samples stored, data that's being stored. Usually when mistakes happen, it can be tied back to a poor system, a poor quality system. It's not usually an accident. It's a poor system to begin with. Let's see. And inside your regulations, you'll see a lot of must and shall language. So those musts are the ones that you have to watch out for. A Part 11 example, record changes shall not obscure previously recorded information. So that's your audit trail. So your audit trails can't overwrite. From the CGMP, current good manufacturing practices, lab records shall include sample description, source, quantity, lot number, date taken, and date received. So you can see they're very, very specific. Quality systems regulation, this is the medical devices. Those records stored in automated data processing systems shall be backed up. We're going to talk about backups in the second section this afternoon. Okay, and we talked about your predicate rules, your GXP, GCP, GLP, GMP. I'm sure there's a lot of other ones in here. G something P's. These are all pretty self-explanatory in here, your predicate rules. All of these things are about establishing an ongoing system. So any kind of a quality system should have all of these elements in it. And it should all be documented. So these are all parts of the system. And as we talked about before, the system is compliant, not just the software. 21 CFR Part 11. So how many people think that Freezerworks is 21 CFR Part 11 compliant? No. Systems are compliant, not software. Wrong. Okay. I'll show that slide a few more times. I think you have some extra slides with that in there. So, for example, Freezerworks has an audit trail. If you don't turn it on, you're not compliant. So, it's not the software, it's the whole system. You have to have a requirement that you do track the audit trail, and somebody has to check and make sure that it's turned on and that it's working. Okay, as we talked about before, I'm sure everybody knows, Part 11 is electronic records and signatures. And this is in addition to your predicate rules. They generally don't conflict. But Part 11 is just a little bit more specific for electronic records. But you shouldn't ever see a conflict between your predicate rules and the Part 11 for electronic records. And as we can see from this slide, what data does it apply to? Pretty much everything. Anything created, modified, maintained, archived, retrieved, or transmitted. That's pretty much all your records that are stored electronically. If you're still storing things on spiral notebooks and Post-its, Part 11 doesn't apply to you. So you're good. But most people aren't these days. If I would have asked that question 20 years ago, probably half the people would say at least part of their system is still on spiral notebooks. We converted a lot of people. One of the main concepts of the 21 CFR Part 11 is that electronic records must provide at least the same degree of confidence and reliability as the paper. In general, all of your records need to be attributable. You need to know who put them in or who changed them. They have to be in some kind of human readable form at some point, if the FDA asks you to export all your data to them to show a certain facet of what you're storing, it all has to be able to be produced in human readable form. And it should be contemporaneous, so taking place at the same time the activity does. So if you're processing a sample, the data should be real time in your database. And of course, accuracy is one of the things that we're trying to ensure with this. And here we have the main and only real elements of Part 11. I've read all 5,000 lines. I just about have it memorized. But it basically boils down into these 8 different things. It's really pretty simple. This is it in a nutshell, all these things. System security, of course, is just making sure the right people are allowed in and other people are not. Software and system validation. We're going to go over that in more detail in the second session this afternoon. Audit trails. Like I said, they got to be turned on. You need to know what it changed from and what it changed to, who did it, and the date and the time that it was performed. Electronic signatures, which is something Freezerworks doesn't quite have at this time. Is anybody using electronic signatures now in their laboratory? Do you have some? Okay. And of course, your password maintenance, record retention, and protection. I kind of lumped all these together, but they're separated out in the CFR, operational authority and device checks. Operational checks are just the sequencing of events so that your system has the integrity to know that you can't enter a sample in a location unless you've entered the freezer first. So just kind of the order and sequencing of events. Authoritative checks are just making sure, like I said, the right person does the right thing. And device checks are the validity of the source of the data that's coming in. Okay. Any questions on Part 11? Let's see if our Part 11. You can get the full text of it, the big long thing, at the FDA.gov website, or you could just send me an email and I'll send it to you. And the third thing that we're going to talk about today is software development versus the system development. What's the difference and what am I responsible for as far as the development goes of the system? And at DataWorks, it's important to make the differentiation. At DataWorks, our system development is making software. So our system is just set up to make the software. But in a lab, your system might be storing tissue samples or processing HIV samples, those kind of things. So your whole system needs to include everything you do with a sample from start to finish, not just the software portion. But our system is making the software. So that's what we do. And the whole point, again, is to build integrity into the entire system, not just test for it afterwards with your software. And the FDA attitude, of course, is, and I have this straight from their mouth, if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. So it's important in all these steps to make sure you have your documentation in order. Okay, system development. That's you guys. Your system documentation needs to include all of these things. Just because I make software and I know all of you, I can't anticipate all your combinations of these different elements. So your system needs to be sure and include all of these things. And the FDA calls the combination of these elements your intended use. Your intended use of what you're going to be doing. Okay, so the first portion of that is your Equipment and hardware includes all of these things, your processors, your disk drives, peripherals. Your IT department guys in here can probably come up with at least 10 other things that fall under the equipment and hardware category, but the unique combination of these is they're like snowflakes. Everybody's different. Just because you think you've got the same printer as someone else, you ordered it from the same place, you use the same part number, looks the same, it's supposed to work the same, but it doesn't. Well, maybe your firmware is different. You just don't know. So everybody's completely different. You might have the same operating system that I use to test Freezerworks, but you might be using a different service pack. And then everything is different. You need to be documenting and testing your entire system. Your networks. This is usually out of the hands of the laboratory. Usually it's an IT kind of function, but it's still important to document all of these different things that come into play because these all have the potential of affecting your data. Okay, your software within your system. We're going to talk about the software requirements and specifications in the next section. But it's very important to be sure that you document all of these different pieces of your software. Not just Freezerworks, what operating system you're using, if you're using tools. We talked about crystal reports earlier. If you were to bundle that with your Freezerworks, it needs to be documented. And it's important to document, too, as you're talking about the specifics of these, to not just say, we're going to purchase software that's 21 CFR Part 11 compliant. You have to get more specific than that. What pieces do you need? And again, we're going to go over that this afternoon. And the procedures, very important. If you have poorly written procedures, it can negate your compliance for even the most expensive software and hardware packages. You might spend all your money on this big fancy hardware system, but if you don't have good procedures, it's going to just blow the whole thing. For example, in Freezerworks, the system administrator might track all the active users, but if the procedure doesn't call for him to deactivate people when they leave, if someone's fired or they go to another job, that's not a list of authoritative users for the system. And the FDA would call you on that. You've got extra people in there that are allowed to use the system, and they're no longer supposed to be allowed to use the system. Another example of a policy or procedure that's very important is not to share your passwords. Well, if the FDA inspector walks through and he sees somebody's password stuck on a Post-it next to the computer, you've just invalidated the whole system. So important to have good procedures and quality checks to make sure that they're being followed. Your staff. Everybody needs to be qualified and documented. What training have they had? What authority do they have? What are their jobs? So all the education, in-house training, external training. Every time somebody stays awake through a whole QA session lecture, that counts. I'll write you a note. Okay, software development. That's us, that's me. These are pretty much the universal elements of software development. And this is what we do all day long, every day. If you develop software in-house, you need to be following all these same elements, one after another. If you have external people developing your software or contractors developing your software, you need to qualify them and make sure that they're following all these steps as well. We call this method of development the waterfall method. Is it waterfall? It's a combination of waterfall and iterative development steps. That just means we go through one step, one after the other, before we go on to the next. And iterative in that while 5.0 is still in development and we're in the validation stage of 5.0 for Freezerworks, we've still got bug fixes going in 4.0 that other people had to have. So we can't just do one thing, stop, and then start the next one. They're all cycling through at once. And SDLC is common terminology for software development lifecycle. Okay. The first step in any software development is establishing your user requirements. Similar to your system development, where you're going to be establishing your user requirements for your entire system. In the software, we will send out user surveys, we do evaluations. That's why it's so important for you to turn in your surveys and user evaluations. We really do look at all of them, prioritize every single item based on how difficult it would be to code, if it's going to take months and months, lots of resources, and the importance of it. So if it's highly important and not very difficult, of course it's going to get done. If it's highly important and very difficult, it's probably going to get done, but it's going to take a lot longer. And then we set up the scheduling for that, which versions things are going to go in. So Cheryl will be talking about the future of DataWorks a little later. And every time someone turns in a request for something outside of these surveys, we keep track of all of your requests and ideas also. We have a giant database of error reports and modification requests. Okay, and I'll jump right down to specifications and coding. This is going to include our functional and design specifications, but as we talked about the standards that are followed, we have certain coding standards based on our language that we use to program in. We make sure that we follow all of those. Just like you have your predicate rules, we have rules as well for software development. Traceability means being able to trace every line of code back to its original specification. So not only the functional specification and design, but back to the user that requested that particular change, or the development meeting that we had that decided we were going to add that certain module. During the coding, it's after Cheryl and the developers make their code, we do peer code reviews, and the programmers all test their own code. That's before it even goes to formal validation. So there are validation steps, even in the coding phase. And of course, our validation efforts are huge. We try to test for everything. Internal validation, common terminology is black box testing versus white box testing. A black box testing is what you would do. We do it also. But that just means that you put a certain input in, you're expecting it to come out a certain way, but you don't really know what's processing on the inside of the program. So it's expected input and output, those kind of tests. White box testing is what we do more extensively, and that's where we have to test every line of code. So our testing process includes tests for every single line of code. And of course we have our beta sites, our very, very helpful beta sites. Once we get through we run through validation rounds, probably 3 full complete rounds of testing the entire program with every combination of elements that we can think of. And then once we do that, we release it to the beta sites. And as we're doing our final brush-up round of validation, the beta sites are putting it through their intended use cases. So with their hardware, different operating systems, and different uses. And even with all the testing we do, usually the beta sites still manage to come up with a few surprises and test it for us. And of course, all of our validation is documented extensively. We have roomfuls of validation materials. And final, just our version control as we're sending things out. We will send out technical bulletins, which will identify if something is a maintenance update, a smaller program update, or a major upgrade, like this Freezerworks Unlimited 5.0 that's coming out. That's a major upgrade. That would be, it's got the engine change in it, so that's big. Change management, we have to document every single change that we do to the program. You'll find those in your README files and your technical bulletins. And the release tracking. We have to keep track of which user has which version of the software. If someone has 4.0.17 versus 4.0.23, we keep track of all that. Okay, so any questions on system development or software development? Has anyone participated in formal system development? Do you know if you have them? A couple people.
Do you guys help with that? Because I just tell people I agree with it.
You still have to test for it. You still have to test for it. We don't, no. Not at this point. We used to back in the old days when we did a lot more one-on-one. And we actually went to the labs to install it. But you need to come up with your own user requirements.
What version will you have to be at to get to 5?
You can actually upgrade. A developer can correct me on this, but I think you can upgrade from any version that's not too far back. It might take multiple steps to get there. So if you're at, I don't know if we've got anybody still at 2, or there might be a couple of people that are 3, and you would have to upgrade to 4 before you get to 5. Yes?
Are we going to be discussing how we do go about doing validation within our own lab with our equipment and everything in the second session?
Yes, in the second session. We will be going over the specifics on what you need to validate. And a lot of it's going to be subjective, though, because you are such a big, diverse group. But it's all part of documenting your own systems and your requirements, combining it with what you have.